One thing to bear in mind with the South Sea Islanders and the First Nations people who were hung, from the 1850s onwards in Queensland, they'd all but abandoned the idea of public hangings, except the South Sea Islanders and First Nations people, who they made an exception for, and they would bring South Sea Islanders and First Nations people in to witness the hangings, essentially so they would send a message back to the community that they came from, that this would be the consequences of any sort of behaviour unacceptable to the whites. So to me that shows, like, again, it would appear that a lot of them would be guilty of what we would consider now acts of resistance or retaliation for the violence that they suffered. But I don't know the details and the ins and outs of every trial, but as a general pattern that appears to be the case.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Would they've been carried out in public places, or were they within the jails themselves?
They were within the jails themselves, but they would bring, in the case of South Sea Islanders and First Nations people, they would bring South Sea Islanders and First Nations people into the jails to witness the executions. They didn't do that for white prisoners, basically. And it was to send a message very much back to the communities. Now, in terms of, there was the campaign to end the death penalty. That's something that Queenslanders are very proud of, is that we were the first part of the British Empire to end capital punishment in 1922 under the Ryan government. But it is instructive to look a bit at the public debate leading up to the end of the death penalty, in that a lot of the growth in public support and public campaigning against the death penalty started, as it says here, I'll just read this from the abolition of hanging. There was public support and political support for the abolition of the death penalty grew in the early 1900s for various reasons. Some was the controversial execution of a couple of convicted murderers, including Patrick Kenneth, who a lot of people consider was Queensland's last bushranger, and another fellow called Arthur Ross. That both of those attracted public sympathy and support from people within the labour movement. And there was also the rising strength of the socialist element within the Queensland Labour Party. The first bill to outlaw capital punishment was introduced into the Queensland Parliament in 1910, and the first member to call for more than just a winding back of capital punishment and for the total abolition was a Labour MP called Joe Lucena, who, like a lot of good Labour MPs, ended up getting expelled from the Labour Party. But he gave his first speech opposing the death penalty. But another reason for the uptake in the opposition to the death penalty, certainly, it seems to be a bit of coincidence with the introduction of the White Australia policy and the forced repatriation of a lot of South Sea Islanders back. That's when suddenly there was less opposition to abolishing the death penalty. It was because, as it says here, it says people like Lucena, who was a campaigner against the death penalty, appeared to have been torn between the pleasure of pointing to such executions as evidence of the corrupting influence of the Kanakas on society, and the sorrow that that society should deem it necessary to such a barbaric and degrading punishment for people. So it's essentially saying, as it says here, that even after the federal government had legislated to terminate the transportation of Kanakas, the tendency continued for the worker and labour men generally to ignore the executions of both Kanakas and Chinese, and the continuance of this practice, however, possibly be partly explained. It's saying that partly the reason that they didn't publicly oppose it was they were worried about political fallout because of the racism of the general population. Part of it was political expediency, but also people like even Joe Lucena, who was passionate in opposing the death penalty, was still or would be considered by today's standard, is a strong supporter of the White Australia policy. So we should be proud of that. We're the first part of the British Empire to abolish the death penalty, but we should also be conscious of that that support for opposing the death penalty was a bit conditional and a bit yeah, was, if I can put that in a polite way, yeah. Okay, sorry, as well.